When you think of drug dealers, you think of violence, guns, gangs, street corners, murder. George Jung wasn't like that. He was a middle-class kid from Massachusetts who wanted to make money and have fun. He never killed anyone. He wasn't violent. He didn't join a gang. He just sold drugs. A lot of drugs at his peak. 85% of the cocaine that entered the United States came through George Jung. 85%. If you or anyone you knew used cocaine in the 1970s or early 1980s, it probably came from him. He made hundreds of millions of dollars. He partied with Pablo Escobar. He lived in mansions, drove exotic cars, and had everything money could buy. And he lost it all. He spent 20 years in prison. His daughter won't speak to him. His fortune is gone. His friends are dead or in prison. He died in 2021 at age 78. Broke and alone. You've seen the movie Blow. Johnny Depp played George Jung and made him look cool, rebellious, and almost heroic. The real George Jung? His story is more tragic, more complex, and more devastating than any movie could show, because the movie had to end after 2 hours. His real life? 78 years of consequences. This is the true story of the man who supplied America's cocaine and paid for it with everything that mattered. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? I want to see how far this reaches across the world. Hit that subscribe button if you want deep, research true crime content. This is part of my Real Stories Behind Movies series. If you liked my Godfather, Casino, or Goodfellas videos, you'll want this, like this video right now. It tells YouTube this is valuable content and helps more people find it. This is 3 hours of the complete true story of George Jung, from childhood in Massachusetts to his death in 2021. Everything you're about to hear is documented, verified, and true. If you haven't seen the movie Blow, that's fine. This story stands on its own. But if you have seen it, prepare to learn what really happened. One more thing. This video discusses drug trafficking for educational and historical purposes. I'm not glorifying this lifestyle. By the end, you'll understand why. Let's begin with a regular American kid who made one terrible decision. On August 6, 1942, in the middle of World War II, a baby was born in Weymouth, Massachusetts. His name was George Jacob Jung. There was nothing special about this birth. No signs, no omens. Just another American baby in a small town near Boston. His father was Fred Jung. Fred was a carpenter. He worked with his hands, built things, made an honest living. He wasn't rich, but he provided for his family. Fred was a good man, hardworking, honest, reliable. His mother was Ermin Jung. She was a German immigrant who had come to America for a better life. Ermin was difficult. She had high expectations. She wanted more than what they had. She wasn't satisfied with their middle-class existence. The Jung family was perfectly normal. Not poor. They had a house, food on the table, clothes to wear. Not rich. No luxuries, no savings. Living paycheck to paycheck. Just average, just American, just normal. George grew up in the 1940s and 1950s in Weymouth. He was a normal kid. He played sports in the street with neighborhood kids. He went to school. He did his homework. Sometimes he played football. He had friends. Nothing about young George indicated he would become one of America's most notorious drug smugglers. But he noticed something early. Something that would shape his entire life. Money mattered. George would later describe a memory that haunted him his entire life. He was young, maybe 10 or 11 years old. He was in his bedroom, supposed to be sleeping, but downstairs. His parents were fighting. Again, they fought constantly. And it was always about the same thing. Money, his mother's voice. Shrill and angry. You'll never amount to anything, Fred. Never. We have nothing because of you. His father's voice, tired and defeated. I'm doing the best I can, Ermin. I work every day. I provide. Provide? Provide? Look at this house. Look at our lives. The Johnsons have a new car. The Smiths went on vacation. What do we have? Nothing. Young George lay in bed, listening to his father's spirit break. Night after night, week after week, year after year, Fred Jung worked hard. He was skilled at his trade. He was reliable, honest. He did everything right, and it wasn't enough. George watched his father work himself to exhaustion for modest pay. Watched his mother berate him for not making more. Watched money, or the lack of it, destroy his parents' happiness, and young George made a decision that would determine the course of his life. I will never be poor. I will never let money control me like it controls my father. This seems reasonable, right? Who wants to struggle financially? But George drew the wrong conclusion. He didn't think, I'll work hard and build a career and financial security. He thought, my father works honest jobs and struggles. Therefore, honest work doesn't pay. I need to find a different way. This is where it started. Not with drugs, not with crime, with an attitude toward money, with a belief that the normal path, education, career, hard work, was a sucker's game. He was 10 years old, and he'd already decided the rules didn't apply to him. George went to Weymouth High School in the late 1950s. He was popular, good-looking kid. Athletic, played football, was decent at it, had friends, had girlfriends. He wasn't a great student. Didn't care much about academics. Why would he? In his mind, school was preparing him for the same kind of life his father had. Working hard for modest pay, struggling, being told you're not enough. He graduated in 1961. His parents wanted him to go to college. They saw education as the path to a better life than they'd had. George went to the University of Southern Mississippi. He lasted 2 years. He hated it, the structure, the requirements. The idea that he was supposed to sit in classrooms for 4 years to get a piece of paper that would qualify him for a job that would pay him just enough to get by. Like his father, no thanks. He dropped out at age 20. Now what? No degree, no skills, no direction, no plan. But he had something else. The absolute certainty that he would never be poor. In 1964, at age 22, George Jung made a decision that millions of young Americans were making in the 1960s. He was moving to California. He packed everything he owned into his car and drove cross-country. 3,000 miles from the cold winters and judgmental eyes of Massachusetts to the promised land of Southern California. When George Jung arrived in Manhattan Beach, California, he thought he'd found paradise. Endless beaches, perfect weather, beautiful people everywhere, surf culture, freedom. The 1960s were happening, and California was the center of it all. This was the life he dreamed about, but there was a problem. Paradise costs money. George needed to work. Even in paradise, you need to eat. You need somewhere to sleep. He got odd jobs. Waiter at a restaurant. Moving furniture, construction work, whatever he could find. The pay was minimum wage in 1964. That was $1.25 an hour. In today's money, that's about $12 an hour. George was working 40, sometimes 50 hours a week, and he could barely afford rent on a tiny apartment that he shared with 3 roommates. This wasn't the California dream. He'd look around at the wealthy people in Manhattan Beach, the ones with nice cars and beach houses, the ones who seemed to have endless money to party and have fun. How are they doing it? They weren't working minimum wage jobs. George was 24 years old, living in paradise, and broke. Sound familiar? It's the story of millions of young people who move to expensive cities chasing dreams. Most people in George's situation do one of 2 things. They work their way up, or they go home. George did something different. Southern California in the mid-1960s had a thriving beach culture, surfing, parties, music, freedom, and marijuana. Marijuana was everywhere. It was illegal, yes, but among young people. Especially in the beach communities, it was socially acceptable. Normal, everyone smoked it. George smoked marijuana. He liked it. It made him relaxed, made parties more fun, made the beach lifestyle even better. But George noticed something. People would pay for marijuana. Good marijuana was hard to find. His roommates would ask him, "Hey George, can you get some weed?" And George thought, "Why am I working minimum wage when I could sell weed?" The economics were simple. Buy marijuana for $40. Sell it for $60. That's $20 profit. Do that 10 times? That's $200. Do it every day? That was more than he made in a week at his regular job. George Jung was 24 years old when he made his first drug deal. He bought a small amount of marijuana from a dealer he knew. Maybe an ounce or two. Paid maybe $40. Sold it to friends for $60. Profit, $20. It took him 20 minutes. He thought, this is easy. Why am I working 40 hours a week for $50 when I can make $20 in 20 minutes? It's the math that traps people, the easy money math. He made another deal, then another. Within a few weeks, he was selling marijuana regularly. Within a few months, he was making more selling marijuana than from his regular job. So he quit his job. At age 24, George Jung became a full-time marijuana dealer. This was the moment. This was the choice. He could have stayed at the regular job, worked his way up, maybe become a manager, make $3 or $4 an hour, built a legitimate career. Instead, he chose easy money, and easy money is never easy for long. George started small, selling to friends, then friends of friends, then strangers. Within a year, he was dealing to dozens of people, making thousands of dollars per month. In 1967, for a 25-year-old with no education, this was serious money. He upgraded his apartment, bought nicer clothes, a better car, started living the California lifestyle he dreamed about, and the business kept growing. But where was the marijuana coming from? Mexico. Mexico is right across the border from California. In Mexico, marijuana grew easily. Farmers grew it by the acre. It was cheap, really cheap. American dealers would drive to Mexico, meet with suppliers, buy pounds of marijuana for maybe $10 a pound, then smuggle it back across the border hidden in their cars. In California, that same pound sold for $50, $100. The profit margins were incredible. George saw this and had an idea. Why should he drive to Mexico himself? That was risky, time-consuming, limited in scale. Better idea. Become a wholesaler. George started buying large amounts of marijuana. Not ounces, pounds, not pounds, hundreds of pounds. He found Mexican suppliers who would deliver to California. He'd buy in bulk, sometimes half a ton at a time. Then he wouldn't sell to individual users. He'd sell to other dealers, people who would then sell to users. He became a middleman, a wholesaler, a distributor. The profit margins were smaller per pound, but the volume was massive. Buy for $20 a pound. Sell for $50 a pound. That's $30 profit per pound. Now multiply that by 500 pounds. That's $15,000 profit. Per shipment. Multiple times per month. George Jung, at age 26, was making more money than he'd ever imagined. George had a childhood friend from Massachusetts named Richard Burrell. Everyone called him Tuna. Tuna had also moved to California. He was working as a hairdresser, a legitimate job. But Tuna, like George, loved money and adventure. George approached him. Want to make real money? How? Tuna asked, selling weed wholesale. Tuna thought about it for maybe 5 seconds. I'm in. The partnership was formed. George handled the supply side. He dealt with the Mexican suppliers. He organized the buying and the smuggling across the border. Tuna helped with distribution. He found buyers, other dealers who wanted to buy in bulk. He collected money. He helped expand the network. Together, they built a marijuana distribution business. Within a year, They weren't moving hundreds of pounds. They were moving tons, literally tons, thousands of pounds of marijuana. George Jung was now 26 to 28 years old. He had a nice apartment in Manhattan Beach, multiple expensive cars, Porsches, sports cars, designer clothes, Rolex watches. He partied constantly. Beautiful women, endless parties on the beach, drugs, alcohol, everything. This was the California dream. This was what he'd wanted. And it was all funded by marijuana. George told himself he was doing nothing wrong. He had to rationalize it, right? He wasn't a bad person. Marijuana isn't really a drug, he'd tell himself. It's just a plant. It's harmless. People are going to smoke it anyway. Might as well be me selling it. The only reason it's illegal is stupid laws. I'm not hurting anyone. Classic criminal rationalization. Making himself the good guy in his own story. The truth? Marijuana is relatively harmless compared to other drugs. But it was illegal. He was breaking the law. And he was doing it purely for money. But in 1968 to 1970, George Jung didn't care about any of that. He was 28 years old, making tens of thousands of dollars per month. Living in a beach paradise, life was perfect. But success brings problems. The business was growing too fast. They were moving too much marijuana through California, making too much money, getting too visible. The police were starting to notice. When pounds and pounds of marijuana are flooding a market, law enforcement pays attention. Competitors were getting jealous. Other dealers didn't like George and Tuna controlling so much of the supply. The risk was increasing. George needed a solution, and he found one. A solution that would make him millions of dollars, and ultimately cost him everything. George had an idea, a brilliant idea. From a business perspective, why limit himself to California? Marijuana demand was national. People all over America wanted marijuana. But the supply was concentrated in the West Coast and Southwest, because that's where Mexico was close. The East Coast, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, had huge demand for marijuana. Millions of potential customers, but the supply was limited. It had to be transported from California or Mexico. This meant the prices on the East Coast were HIGH, much higher than in California. In California, George could buy a pound of marijuana for $50 and sell it for $80, $100. On the East Coast, that same pound sold for $300, $400. The profit margins were insane. If George could figure out how to transport marijuana from California to the East Coast, he could make a fortune. But how do you transport it? Driving cross-country was risky. It took days. Highway patrol could stop you anywhere. It was slow. You could only move limited quantities in a car. George needed something faster, something that could move large quantities, something that avoided highway checkpoints. He needed an airplane. George found pilots. Private pilots who were willing to smuggle marijuana for the right price. And George was willing to pay the right price. The operation was simple. The pilots would load a small private plane with hundreds of pounds of marijuana in California. They'd fly cross-country, usually at night. At low altitude to avoid radar, they'd land at small, private airports in Massachusetts or New York. Places with no security, no customs, no checks. They'd unload the marijuana. Local dealers would pick it up. The plane would fly back empty. The whole operation took less than 24 hours. George would pay the pilots $10,000, $20,000 per flight. Good money for them. But George was making 10 times that in profit per flight. The first flight was a test. It worked perfectly. They made a huge profit. So they did another flight, then another. Soon they were flying multiple times per month, then multiple times per week. They were moving thousands of pounds of marijuana from California to the East Coast. The money was pouring in. George Jung, at age 28, was a millionaire. Let me repeat that. At age 28, with no college degree, no legitimate job, George Jung was a millionaire. In 1970, $1 million is equivalent to about $8 million today. He was rich, self-made, successful, all from selling marijuana. He had the California dream, the American dream, the life his father never had. He'd proven his mother wrong. He'd proven everyone wrong. He would amount to something. He would be rich, and he'd done it his way. The movie Blow shows this era pretty accurately. Johnny Depp captures George's charm, his confidence, his intelligence. The beach lifestyle is shown correctly. The parties, the money, the excitement. What the movie softens is how much of this was luck. George Jung wasn't a genius. He was a regular guy who was in the right place at the right time, with the right connections, and no fear of consequences. California in the late 1960s and early 1970s was perfect for marijuana dealing. High demand, close to supply, limited law enforcement focus on marijuana. Youth culture accepting it. George had the luck to be there, the connections to capitalize on it, and the lack of moral hesitation to do it. He thought he was smart. He thought he'd figured out a system. He was just lucky, and luck doesn't last forever. By 1971, George was making too much money too fast. He was living too visibly. Expensive cars, luxury apartments, partying with celebrities. Too many people knew what he did. The pilots talked. The dealers talked. Word spreads. Competitors were envious. Some were talking to the police. The FBI was investigating. They had informants in the marijuana trade. They were watching. George ignored all the warning signs. Why? Because it was working. The money kept rolling in. Every month was more profitable than the last. This is the classic mistake, confusing luck with skill. Thinking, I'm getting away with it, means I'll always get away with it. George thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. You can't smuggle thousands of pounds of drugs for years without getting caught. The FBI had been building a case for months. They had informants, they had wiretaps, they had evidence. In April 1974, George Jung was arrested in Chicago. He was caught with 660 pounds of marijuana. Federal charges, drug trafficking across state lines, conspiracy. He was facing serious prison time. Maybe 10 years, maybe more. George was 32 years old. Everything he built, the money, the cars, the lifestyle was about to disappear. He posted bail, $1 million. He had the money, so he got out while awaiting trial. His lawyers told him the case was bad. The evidence was strong. He'd probably be convicted in 1975. George Jung was convicted of drug trafficking. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison. 4 years. At age 32, George would go to prison. He'd be 36 when he got out. Everything was seized. The government took his money, his cars, his property, everything they could find. George Jung was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, federal prison. For a middle-class kid from Massachusetts who'd never been violent, never hurt anyone, just sold marijuana, this should have been a wake-up call. This should have been the moment he learned his lesson. Crime doesn't pay. Get out while you can. Go straight. Find a legitimate path. That's what he should have learned. But that's not what happened. Instead, George Jung went to prison and learned something completely different. He learned how to smuggle cocaine. Let me explain what federal prison is for those who don't know. Federal prison is where you go when you commit federal crimes. Crimes that cross state lines, drug trafficking, bank robbery, stuff like that. Danbury was a medium security federal prison. Not maximum security. That's for the most dangerous violent criminals. Not minimum security. That's more like a camp. Medium security means cells, bars, guards, walls. It's still prison, no freedom. Locked in a cell most of the day. Prison food, prison routine. But it wasn't as violent as state prisons. Federal prisons tend to be safer because the inmates are usually white-collar criminals or drug traffickers, not violent gang members. George Jung became inmate number 19,225. In prison, inmates form groups based on their crimes. Drug dealers hang out with drug dealers. Thieves with thieves. Fraudsters with fraudsters. It makes sense. You have something in common. You understand each other's world. George was placed with other drug traffickers. And that's when he realized something. He'd thought he was a big-time drug dealer, moving tons of marijuana, making millions. But in Danbury, he met people who were operating on a completely different level. International smugglers. People moving tons of drugs. Not just marijuana, but cocaine, heroin. People connected to cartels in Colombia, Mexico, Asia. People making tens of millions of dollars. George looked around and thought, I was thinking too small. Most people go to prison and think, I never want to come back here. George went to prison and thought, I need to level up. That should tell you everything about George Jung's mindset. One day in 1974, George Jung met a man who would change his life forever. His name was Carlos Lehder. Carlos was Colombian, about 25 years old, around the same age as George. He was in Danbury for car theft, a relatively minor charge. But Carlos's real background was far more significant. Carlos came from Medellín, Colombia. His family had connections to the cocaine trade. Not major players yet, but connected. Medellín, Colombia was becoming the center of cocaine production in the world. The coca plant grows in South America. Colombian criminals had figured out how to process it into cocaine powder, and they were starting to organize. Carlos knew cocaine suppliers. He knew producers. He knew pilots. He knew smugglers. He had the connections. What he didn't have was American distribution. He didn't know how to move large quantities of cocaine into the United States and distribute it nationwide. George Jung had exactly what Carlos needed, and Carlos had exactly what George needed. George and Carlos became friends. They might have been cellmates, or at least in the same wing. They talked for hours, days, months. George told Carlos about his marijuana smuggling operation, the pilots, the distribution network across America, the connections to dealers in every major city. Carlos told George about cocaine, the production in Colombia, the massive profit margins, the exploding demand in America. Both of them realized, together, they could build an empire. Let me explain what cocaine is for younger viewers who might not know. What is cocaine? Cocaine is a drug made from the coca plant, which grows in South America, mainly Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. It's a stimulant, meaning it makes you feel energized, confident, alert, euphoric. It makes you feel like you can do anything. It makes you talk faster, think faster, feel more powerful. The high lasts maybe 30 minutes to an hour. Then you crash. You feel terrible. And you want more. That's why it's addictive. You keep chasing that high, and the more you use it, the more you need to get the same effect. In the 1970s, cocaine was becoming popular in America. Rich people used it, celebrities, business executives. It was expensive, called the champagne of drugs, but the demand was exploding. More and more people wanted it, and the supply couldn't keep up. That meant the prices were HIG, and the profit margins were insane. Over months of conversations, George and Carlos developed a plan to smuggle cocaine from Colombia to America on a massive scale. Here's how it would work. Step 1. Carlos would go to Colombia after his release. He'd connect with cocaine producers in Medellín. He'd secure a large, reliable supply of cocaine. Step 2. They'd transport the cocaine from Colombia to America. Carlos knew Colombian pilots who could fly small planes. They'd fly from Colombia to the Bahamas, a short distance, just a few hundred miles. Step 3. From the Bahamas, they'd smuggle the cocaine into Florida. The Bahamas are very close to Florida. You can see Florida from some Bahamas islands. They'd use small planes or boats. Step 4. George would distribute the cocaine across America. He'd use his marijuana distribution network. All those dealers in California, New York, Boston, Chicago, They'd sell cocaine instead of marijuana, or in addition to marijuana. Step 5. They'd split the profits 50/50ths. Both would become extremely rich. George and Carlos actually did a business analysis. They thought about this like entrepreneurs. Marijuana profit margins. Buy for $50 per pound in Mexico. Sell for $300 per pound in New York. That's 6x profit, good business. Cocaine profit margins. Buy for $2,000 per kilogram in Colombia. Sell for $60,000 per kilogram in America. That's 30x profit. Insane business plus. Cocaine was concentrated. A kilogram of cocaine is about 2 pounds, about the size and weight of a bag of sugar. But it was worth $60,000 on American streets. You could smuggle 100 kilograms pretty easily. That fit in a few suitcases. 100 kilograms equals $6 million in street value. The math was irresistible. George knew cocaine was different from marijuana. Marijuana is a plant, low potency, relatively harmless. Users mostly remain functional. Cocaine is a processed drug, powerful, highly addictive. Users become addicts, lives get destroyed. Marijuana penalties were moderate. A few years in prison for trafficking. Cocaine penalties were severe. Decades in federal prison, mandatory minimums. George K.N.E.W. Cocaine was more dangerous, both legally and morally. He didn't care. The money was too good. Carlos taught George everything about the cocaine trade. How cocaine is produced. You start with coca leaves. Farmers harvest them. They're processed into coca paste. The paste is refined into cocaine powder. It's a chemical process requiring expertise. Who controls it? Colombian cartels, specifically the Medellín Cartel, which was forming in the mid-1970s. The cost in Colombia, $2,000 to $5,000 per kilogram, depending on purity and quantity. The price in America, $50,000 to $60,000 per kilogram. The markup was astronomical. For every kilogram they could smuggle and sell, they'd make around $50,000 profit. If they could move 100 kilograms per month, that was $5 million profit per month, split 50/50ths. George makes $2. $5 million per month. Carlos makes $2. $5 million per month. George had made maybe $2 to $3 million total from his marijuana operation over several years. With cocaine, he could make that much in a single month. Danbury Federal Prison in the mid-1970s was full of drug traffickers. George networked. He treated prison like business school. He met pilots who knew smuggling routes. He met distributors who could move large quantities. He met money launderers who could hide profits. He was building a network. A criminal network that would serve him when he got out. Most people use prison time to reflect, to change, to plan a better life. George used prison time to prepare for bigger crimes. George served 4 years with good behavior. He was released in 1978. He was 36 years old. Most people leaving prison after 4 years think, never again. I'm going straight. I'm not coming back here, George Jung thought. Now I can start the real business. Carlos Lehder was released around the same time. Both immediately started working on their plan. George Jung went to prison in 1974 for marijuana trafficking. He came out in 1978 planning cocaine trafficking. He went in as a small-time regional marijuana dealer. He came out connected to what would become the largest cocaine cartel in history. Prison didn't rehabilitate him. Prison educated him in worse crimes. This is the tragedy of the American prison system. It's supposed to reform criminals. Too often, it just creates better, more connected criminals. George Jung is Exhibit A. Here's what kills me about this part of George's story. If George had gone straight after his first prison term, he would have been fine. He was only 36 years old. Still young, still capable, he could have found legitimate work. He was smart, personable, good with people. He could have been a salesman, a manager, anything. He could have had a normal life, met someone, had a family. grown old in peace. Instead, he doubled down on crime. And this time, he wasn't smuggling harmless marijuana. He was about to become one of the largest cocaine traffickers in American history. This was the worst decision of his life, and he made it willingly, knowingly, with full awareness of the risks. The movie Blow shows the friendship between George and Carlos Lehder in prison. This is accurate. The movie shows them planning the cocaine operation together. Accurate. The movie captures Johnny Depp's excitement about the cocaine opportunity. Accurate. What the movie doesn't fully show is how much George knew this was worse than marijuana. In the movie, George seems almost naive, like he doesn't realize how serious cocaine is. In reality, George knew exactly what cocaine was. He knew it destroyed lives. He knew the penalties were severe. He chose the money over morality. Over safety, over everything. That's the real story. The moment George Jung walked out of Danbury Federal Prison in 1978, he contacted Carlos Lehder. Carlos had already gone to Colombia. He'd connected with cocaine producers. The Medellín Cartel was forming, though it wasn't yet the massive organization it would become. The key players were emerging. Pablo Escobar, the Ochoa brothers, Jorge, Juan David, and Fabio, Carlos Lehder, all based in Medellín, Colombia. Carlos told George, "I can get unlimited cocaine. Can you move it in America?" George said, "Absolutely." The partnership was on. George contacted all his old marijuana connections. The dealers in Los Angeles, New York, Austin, Miami, Chicago. The people he'd supplied marijuana to for years. He told them, "Forget weed, I have cocaine now." Most were interested. The profit margins on cocaine were so much better than marijuana. George set up a distribution network across America. The same network he'd used for marijuana, now repurposed for cocaine. Carlos Lehder had a brilliant idea. One of the smartest logistics moves in drug trafficking history. He found a small island in the Bahamas called Norman's Cay. Norman's Cay was barely inhabited, maybe a few dozen residents. It had an airstrip, a small runway for private planes. Carlos essentially bought the island. He bought property. He bribed local officials. He paid off anyone who might cause problems. He turned Norman's Cay into a private smuggling base. Here's how it worked. Colombian planes would load cocaine in Medellín, Colombia. They'd fly north to Norman's Cay in the Bahamas, a flight of a few hours. They'd land on the private airstrip. No customs, no police, no checks. Carlos controlled the entire island. The cocaine would be unloaded. Then American planes would fly from Norman's Cay to Florida, a short flight, maybe 100 miles. Norman's Cay was the perfect transshipment point, the perfect middle station. It removed the risk of flying directly from Colombia to America. It broke the journey into 2 short flights instead of 1 long. Risky flight, brilliant. Carlos sent the first test shipment. Maybe 15 kilograms, about 33 pounds of cocaine. Small. To test the system, the cocaine flew from Medellín to Norman's Cay, then from Norman's Cay to Florida. George received it. He distributed it to his dealers. It sold out in days. The profit was approximately $500,000. George's cut, $250,000. Carlos's cut, $250,000 for 1 shipment, 1 deal. Both George and Carlos looked at each other and realized, we're going to be rich beyond our wildest dreams. If 15 kilograms made them $500,000, what about 100 kilograms? Or 500? Or 1,000? They started increasing shipments. The next shipment, 50 kilograms, then 100 kilograms, then 300 kilograms within months. They were moving tons of cocaine, not pounds, tons. Every shipment meant millions in profit. Let me break down the economics so you understand exactly how this worked. In Colombia, cocaine producers sold to Carlos for $2,000, $5,000 per kilogram. Let's say Carlos bought 100 kilograms at $3,000 per kilo. Total cost, $300,000. Transportation. Carlos paid pilots $100,000 per flight from Colombia to Norman's Cay. He paid bribes in the Bahamas. $50,000. George paid pilots $100,000 for the flight from Norman's Cay to Florida. Total transportation cost, $250,000. In America, George sold to distributors for $50,000, $60,000 per kilogram. 100 kilograms at $55,000 per kilo, $5. 5 million. The math? Revenue? $5. 5 million costs, $550,000. Product plus transport. Profit, $4. 95 million split 50/50. George's cut, $2. 475 million Carlos's cut, $2. 475 million per shipment. And they were doing multiple shipments per month. Do you understand now? Do you see why George couldn't resist? At age 37, George Jung was making more money per month than most people make in their entire lives. By 1981, George and Carlos were operating at massive scale. George later claimed they supplied 85% of America's cocaine. Whether that exact number is accurate is debatable. It's probably an exaggeration, but they were definitely major suppliers. They were moving tons of cocaine per month. George personally made an estimated $100 million over about 3 to 4 years. Let me put that in perspective. $100 million in 1980 equals about $400 million in today's money. George Jung, a high school graduate with no special skills, made the equivalent of $400 million in 4 years. What was George's life like during this period? He bought a mansion in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, ocean view, multiple bedrooms, swimming pool, everything. He bought another mansion in Florida, multiple luxury cars, Porsches, Mercedes, Ferraris, whatever he wanted, private planes, boats, yachts, Rolex watches, expensive suits, designer everything. He partied constantly, threw legendary parties at his mansions. Celebrities attended, or so he claimed. Some disputed this, but there were definitely famous people in his circle. Unlimited cocaine, unlimited alcohol, unlimited everything. Beautiful women everywhere. George Jung, at age 38 to 40, was living a fantasy. He was living the life he dreamed about as a kid, watching his father struggle. He'd proven his mother wrong. He'd proven everyone wrong. He was somebody. He'd amount to something. In 1977, before the cocaine empire really took off, but after his release from prison, George met a woman named Mirtha. Mirtha was Cuban-American, beautiful, wild, fun. She loved cocaine and parties. They fell in love. Or what they thought was love. Really, they were two addicts enabling each other. They got married in 1978. They had a daughter. They named her Christina Sunshine Jung. Christina would become the most important person in George's life, and the person he would hurt the most. Here's where George's story gets tragic in a different way. He wasn't just selling cocaine, he was using it, a lot of it, at first. It was recreational, party drug, social thing. Then it became daily. Every day, cocaine. Then it became an addiction. Cocaine is insidious. It doesn't create physical dependency like heroin, but the psychological addiction is powerful. You feel invincible on cocaine. Confident, powerful, you can do anything. Then you crash, you feel terrible, paranoid, anxious. So you do more cocaine to feel good again. George was using cocaine constantly. And when you're making millions of dollars from cocaine, you have unlimited access. Cocaine makes you paranoid. It makes you erratic. It destroys your judgment. George was making business decisions while high on cocaine. He was getting sloppy. Let me talk about Pablo Escobar, because George's connection to Escobar is important to the story. Who was Pablo Escobar? Pablo Escobar was a Colombian drug lord. He would become the most powerful, most wealthy drug trafficker in history. In the early 1980s, when George knew him, Escobar was still building his empire, but he was already extremely powerful and extremely wealthy. Escobar led the Medellín Cartel. Carlos Lehder was Escobar's partner. George Jung was Carlos's partner. Therefore, George worked with Pablo Escobar. George flew to Colombia multiple times in 1981. He met with Escobar and other cartel leaders at Escobar's estates in Medellín. They discussed business, shipments, money, expansion. George described Escobar as polite, intelligent, and ruthless. Escobar liked George. Americans who could move massive amounts of cocaine were valuable to him. They weren't friends. They didn't hang out socially. But they were business associates. George Jung, a kid from Weymouth, Massachusetts, sitting in a Colombian mansion with Pablo Escobar, discussing how to smuggle tons of cocaine into America. It's surreal when you think about it. Think about where George was at this point in his life. He was 38 to 40 years old. He was worth an estimated $100 million. He owned multiple mansions. He was working with Pablo Escobar, who would go down in history as one of the most notorious criminals ever. He was supplying a significant portion of America's cocaine. He felt invincible. He thought he'd beaten the system. He thought he was too smart, too careful, too connected to get caught. He was wrong. By 1982, problems were emerging. Problem 1. Addiction. George's cocaine use was out of control. He was using heavily every day. Cocaine makes you paranoid. You start seeing threats everywhere. You make bad decisions. George was becoming erratic, sloppy. Problem 2. Mirtha's addiction. His wife Mirtha was also heavily addicted to cocaine. Both parents were using cocaine around their young daughter. Christina was 3 to 4 years old, growing up in chaos. Child Protective Services would eventually investigate. Problem 3. Law enforcement. The DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, was paying attention. Too much cocaine was flooding into America. They knew someone big was supplying it. They were looking for George Jung. Informants were talking. People George thought were loyal were cooperating with authorities. His name kept coming up in investigations. Problem 4. Money problems. This seems crazy, right? George had made $100 million, but where was it? Some was spent on the lifestyle. Mansions, cars, parties, cocaine. Money disappears fast when you're living like a rock star. Some was seized by the government in earlier arrests. Some was poorly hidden. George would bury cash. Forget where he buried it. Seriously. Some was stolen by people he trusted. Despite making $100 million, George wasn't building wealth. He was burning through it. Problem 5. Carlos Lehder issues. Carlos Lehder was becoming more erratic and violent. Carlos ordered murders. He was drawing attention. He was becoming paranoid. The Norman's Cay operation was getting exposed. Journalists were investigating. The Bahamian government was under pressure to shut it down. The partnership with Carlos was becoming dangerous. By 1982, George knew he should quit. He knew he should take whatever money he had left and disappear. Move to a country with no extradition. Start over. He knew he was risking everything. But he couldn't stop. Addiction, greed, ego. He thought, one more big score, then I'll quit. That's what every criminal thinks. One more score, one more deal. That score never comes. There's always one more after that. The movie Blow shows this era accurately in most ways. The wealth and excess are shown correctly. The mansions, the cars, the parties, all real. Johnny Depp captures George's confidence in the feeling of invincibility. The movie shows George meeting Pablo Escobar. This happened. The movie shows the addiction building. Accurate. The movie shows the paranoia and the cracks appearing. Accurate. What the movie compresses is time. This era lasted 4 to 5 years in real life. In the movie, it feels shorter. What the movie captures perfectly is the feeling right before everything collapses. That moment when you're at the peak, everything seems perfect. And you can't see the disaster coming, but it's coming. George Jung was 40 years old in 1982. He'd made more money than most people make in 10 lifetimes. He had a beautiful daughter who loved him. He had everything, and he was about to lose it all. Because you can't smuggle tons of cocaine for years without consequences. The D was closing in, informants were talking. The evidence was mounting. George Jung's empire was about to collapse. And his real punishment, the punishment that would last the rest of his life, was about to begin. The D had been building their case for months, maybe years. They had informants inside George's organization. People he trusted, people he'd done business with for years, who had decided to cooperate with law enforcement to save themselves. They had wiretaps, phone conversations recorded, business discussions, evidence. They had financial records, suspicious bank deposits, money transfers, paper trails. They had surveillance. They'd been watching George, following him, documenting everything. They had enough. It happened at George's home. Federal agents, D, FBI, armed, warrants. George Jung was arrested on federal cocaine trafficking conspiracy charges. This wasn't like his marijuana arrest in 1974. This was major. This was cocaine. This was trafficking on a massive scale. Bail was set at $1 million. George posted it. He had the money, so he got out while awaiting trial. His lawyers examined the evidence. Their assessment. George, the case against you is strong, very strong. You're probably going to be convicted. George had 3 options. Option 1. Flee, take whatever money he had left and run. Fly to a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. Brazil, maybe, or some island nation. Many drug dealers did this. It worked. If you could disappear completely and never come back. George seriously considered it. But he had a daughter. Christina was 4 years old. Could he leave her forever? Never see her again? He couldn't do it. Option 2. Cooperate, testify against Carlos Lehder. Testify against Pablo Escobar. Testify against everyone. The government would offer a deal, reduced sentence. Maybe 5 years instead of 20. Witness protection. George refused. He had a code. You don't rat. You don't testify against your partners. Was this honor? Or stupidity? Probably both. Option 3. Fight the charges, hire the best lawyers. Challenge the evidence. Hope for acquittal or a light sentence. George chose this option. Mistake. George hired expensive defense lawyers. They cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. His lawyers argued. Insufficient evidence. Illegal searches. Violations of rights. But the prosecutors had a strong case. They had wiretaps of George discussing cocaine shipments. They had informants who testified about George's operation. They had financial records showing millions of dollars in suspicious transactions. The evidence was overwhelming before trial. Prosecutors offered a plea deal. George, plead guilty. Cooperate a little. Not full cooperation. Just acknowledge some facts. We'll recommend 10 years. 10 years in federal prison. George refused. He thought his lawyers could win at trial. He thought the jury might acquit him. He thought maybe he'd get a light sentence, even if convicted. He was wrong on all counts. The trial was devastating for George. The prosecution presented their evidence, recordings, testimony, documents. George's lawyers tried to create reasonable doubt. They challenged witnesses. They argued the evidence was circumstantial. The jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for 3 hours. Verdict. Guilty on all counts. The judge had discretion in sentencing. George's lawyers argued for leniency. Your Honor, George Jung has never been violent. He didn't kill anyone. He didn't hurt anyone directly. He has a young daughter. He deserves a second chance. The prosecutor argued for severity. Your Honor, this man trafficked tons of cocaine. He made over $100 million. He poisoned communities. He enabled an epidemic. He deserves decades in prison. The judge's sentence: 20 years in federal prison, plus a $100,000 fine, plus forfeiture of all assets, 20 years. George Jung was 42 years old. He wouldn't get out until he was 62 years old if he served the full sentence. 20 years. Think about that. 20 years of your life. Gone. In a cage. W-H-A-T. He lost one. Money. George had made an estimated $100 million between 1978 and 1982. The government seized millions in assets. Mansions, cars, bank accounts, everything they could find, the rest spent, hidden so well George himself couldn't remember where. Stolen, gone. George Jung would eventually die essentially broke. From $100 million to zero to freedom, 20 years in a federal prison cell. Age 42 to 62. The prime of life, gone. 3. Maria Jamirtha divorced him while he was in prison. She took their daughter Christina. The marriage was over. 4. Relationship with his daughter, this was the worst loss. Christina was 6 years old when George went to prison. She would be 26 years old when he got out. He would miss her childhood, her first day of school, her birthday parties, her teenage years, her high school graduation, her becoming a woman, everything. 20 years of his daughter's life. Gone. 5. His parents. George's father Fred was devastated. His son in federal prison for 20 years. Fred was aging. He wouldn't live to see George get out. Fred Jung died in 1984, just months after George was sent to prison. George couldn't attend his father's funeral. Prison didn't allow it. The last time George saw his father was through prison glass. That guilt would haunt George forever. George was sent to a maximum security federal prison. First Otisville in New York. Later other facilities. This wasn't like Danbury. His first prison. This was a hard time. Dangerous inmates, violent environment, real prison. George was now an inmate number. Just a number. That's all you are in prison, every day. Wake up, breakfast, work detail, lunch, yard time, maybe. Dinner, lockdown, sleep, repeat. For 20 years, every single day. George had a lot of time to think in prison. 20 years is a lot of time. He thought about his daughter Christina growing up without him. He thought about the money he'd wasted. $100 million, and he had nothing to show for it. He thought about the life he'd destroyed. His own life. He thought about the people he'd hurt. The cocaine addicts, the families destroyed by addiction. He thought about whether it was worth it. Was it worth it? 20 years of wealth and fun and excitement for 20 years in a cage? The answer was obvious. No, not even close, but it was too late. After serving 3 years of his 20-year sentence, George was transferred to a lower security facility. And he did something incredibly stupid. He escaped. Let me be clear. Escaping from a federal minimum security camp is technically easy. There are no high walls, no barbed wire, minimal security. You could literally just walk away. Which is exactly what George did. But legally, a huge mistake. George was desperate to see his daughter Christina. Christina was 9 years old. Mirtha wasn't bringing her to visit. George was missing her childhood. He couldn't stand it anymore. He thought, I'll escape. See Christina, spend some time with her, and turn myself in. It was an emotional decision. A father's desperation. It was also incredibly stupid. George escaped in 1987. He was on the run for 7 years. 7 years, he used fake identities. Moved constantly, lived in different states. Stayed off the grid. He tried to contact Christina secretly, but couldn't risk it too much. If he got close to her, the FBI would find him. So the escape accomplished nothing. He still couldn't really see his daughter. 7 years as a fugitive. How did he survive? How did he make money? He went back to drug dealing. It's the only skill George had. The only way he knew how to make money. He started dealing cocaine again. Smaller scale than before. Just enough to survive. But every deal added to his sentence. Every month as a fugitive added to his sentence. He was digging himself deeper and deeper. The FBI finally caught him in Kansas in 1994. They'd been looking for him for 7 years. They had his photo everywhere. Eventually, someone recognized him and called it in. George Jung was arrested on his original charges. He'd escaped. New charges: drug trafficking while a fugitive. Escape charges: he was facing decades in prison now. George stood before a federal judge. The judge was not sympathetic. "Mr. Jung, you were given a 20-year sentence. Instead of serving it, you escaped. While a fugitive, you committed more crimes. You've shown no remorse, no rehabilitation, no respect for the law." The sentence: original 20 years for the cocaine trafficking, plus 15 years for the new drug charges, plus 3 years for escape. Total, nearly 60 years in federal prison. George Jung was 53 years old. If he served the full sentence, he'd be 113 years old when released. He would die in prison. There was no chance of parole, no hope of early release. This was it, the rest of his life. George was sent to Taft Correctional Institution in California. Maximum security, the real deal. This was where he would spend the next 20 years. 20 years in a concrete cell. 20 years watching life pass by through prison bars. 20 years of regret. The movie Blow shows George getting arrested. Accurate, the movie shows him losing everything. Accurate, the movie shows the escape, though it depicts it differently than reality. But he did escape. What the movie doesn't fully show is how long he was actually on the run. 7 years is a long time. What the movie adds are some dramatic scenes for cinematic effect. What the movie perfectly captures is the complete devastation of losing everything that matters. Imagine George's life in the late 1990s. He's in a maximum security prison cell, 10 feet by 8 feet. That's his entire world. He has no money. Everything was seized or spent decades ago. He has no freedom. He'll never be free again. His daughter Christina won't speak to him. She's cut off all contact. She's an adult now, living her own life. He missed her entire childhood and teenage years. His ex-wife Mirtha is struggling with her own addiction issues. Most of his friends from the cocaine days are either dead or in prison themselves. Carlos Lehder was arrested in 1987, extradited to the United States, and is serving a life sentence. Pablo Escobar was killed by Colombian police in 1993. Everyone from the cocaine empire is gone. George is alone, in a cell, for the rest of his life. Somewhere around age 55 to 60. Sitting in that prison cell, George finally understood. He'd traded everything, his freedom, his family, his life, for money that disappeared. He'd destroyed his relationship with his daughter, the most important person in his life. He'd wasted his entire life. He'd hurt countless people. Cocaine addicts whose lives were ruined. Families destroyed by addiction. Communities devastated. He had nothing to show for it. All the money? Gone? All the fun? Brief, decades ago. Barely remembered through the haze of cocaine. All the excitement? Replaced by decades of boredom and regret in a prison cell. George asked himself a question he'd asked 1,000 times. Was it worth it? 5 years of wealth and excitement and living like a king versus 50+ years of consequences. Prison, loss, regret, missing his daughter's life. Was it worth it? The answer was obvious. No, not even close. Nothing was worth what he'd lost. But he couldn't go back. He couldn't undo it. He could only sit in his cell and live with the consequences for the rest of his life. George Jung served in multiple federal prisons over the next 20 years. Taft Correctional Institution in California, Fort Dix in New Jersey, Otisville in New York, back where he'd started decades earlier. The routine never changed. Wake up at 6 a.m., breakfast, prison food. Tasteless, barely nutritious. Work detail. Whatever job they assigned you. Kitchen work, Laundry, maintenance, minimum wage. Maybe $1 a day. Lunch, more prison food. Yard time, if you earned it. An hour outside, walking in circles in a concrete yard. Dinner, prison food again. Lockdown at 7 p.m. Back to your cell, sleep, repeat, every day. The same, for 20 years. George entered prison at age 42, after his first cocaine conviction. Now he was in his 50s. Then 60s, then 70s, his body was deteriorating. Decades of cocaine use had damaged his heart, his liver, his kidneys. Prison food and lack of proper health care weren't helping. His hair turned gray. His face became wrinkled. His body became frail. He was becoming an old man in a prison cell, watching life pass by through prison bars. This was George's greatest regret. His greatest source of pain, his daughter Christina. He'd last seen her when she was 6 years old. Now she was in her 20s, an adult, living her own life. And she wanted nothing to do with him. George wrote to Christina constantly, hundreds of letters over the years. Dear Christina, I know I wasn't there for you. I know I failed you. I'm sorry. I love you. Please forgive me, Christina. I think about you every day. I wonder what you look like now. What you're doing, if you're happy. I wish I could see you. My beautiful daughter. I made terrible choices. I chose money and drugs over you. I destroyed our family. It's my fault, all of it. I'm so sorry. Letter after letter after letter, pouring out his heart, begging for forgiveness, trying to explain, trying to make her understand. For years, Christina didn't respond. Silence, she was angry, hurt, abandoned. Her childhood was destroyed by his choices. She grew up with an addicted mother and an absent father. She had every reason to be angry. Why should she forgive him? Why should she write back? He'd chosen cocaine and money over her. He'd missed her entire childhood. He didn't deserve forgiveness. For years, maybe a decade or more, Christina wouldn't visit, wouldn't write back, wouldn't take his calls. George's greatest regret, his deepest pain. He'd give back all the money, all the mansions and cars and excitement, just to have a relationship with his daughter. But it was too late. The damage was done. In the late 1990s, a journalist wrote an article about George Jung's life. Hollywood noticed. Producers bought the rights to his story. They hired Johnny Depp, a huge movie star, to play George Jung. Director Ted Dem would direct. The movie would be called Blow. George consulted on the film from prison, phone calls, letters. He told stories from his life, helped with details. Did he do this for redemption? To warn young people? Or for ego? To be famous? Probably both. George claimed he wanted the movie to show consequences, to warn people away from crime. Whether that was genuine or just what he told himself is debatable. Blow's released in April 2001. George watched it in prison, through a special screening arranged by the producers. It was emotional for him, seeing his life on screen, seeing what he'd had, seeing what he'd lost, seeing Johnny Depp portray him. Charismatic, intelligent, tragic. The movie showed the rise and the fall, the wealth and the consequences. The movie ends with George old in prison. He imagines a reunion with his daughter. She walks into the prison visiting room. They embrace, they reconcile, but then the camera pulls back. The visiting room is empty. Christina isn't there. It was just George's imagination, his desperate hope for something that might never happen. It's a devastating ending. One of the most emotionally powerful endings in cinema, because it's true. That was George's reality, sitting in prison, hoping for forgiveness that might never come. The movie made $83 million worldwide. Generally positive reviews. Johnny Depp's performance was praised. The story resonated with audiences, but some critics worried the movie glamorized drug dealing. Did it warn people? Or did it make crime look exciting? Young people watched it and saw money, adventure, Johnny Depp looking cool. Did they also see 20 years in prison, Losing everything? Dying alone? It's hard to say. The movie made George Jung famous. Before the movie, he was an unknown prisoner. A nameless inmate. After the movie, he was a celebrity criminal. People wrote him fan mail. Young people said he was their hero. This supposedly horrified George. He didn't want to be an inspiration for crime. He wanted to be a warning. But was that true? Or did he enjoy the attention? Again, probably both. Over the years, George applied for parole multiple times. 2005. Denied. 2008. Denied. 2011. Denied. The parole board's reasoning. Severity of crimes. History of escape. Lack of genuine remorse, in their view. They didn't believe he'd changed. They didn't trust him. He would serve almost his full sentence. After serving 20 years, with some time off for good behavior, George Jung was released from federal prison, June 2, 2014. He was 72 years old, an old man, broken health. No money, but free. Where did he go? He was released to a halfway house in San Francisco first, a transition facility. Then he moved in with his daughter Christina. She had forgiven him. This was the miracle George had prayed for, had written letters about, had dreamed about for 20 years. Christina forgave him. Christina had married. She had children. George's grandchildren. George became a grandfather. They rebuilt their relationship, slowly, carefully. It wasn't perfect. Too much damage. Too many years lost, but they had something. Christina gave him the gift of forgiveness. The one thing more valuable than all the money he'd ever made. George had no money. He'd made an estimated $100 million between 1978 and 1982. He died with about $10,000 to his name. He lived on Social Security, about $1,200 per month. Sometimes he sold autographs online for $50 each. Pathetic. From $100 million to selling autographs for $50. That's what drugs and crime do to money. Decades of cocaine use had destroyed George's body. Kidney failure. He needed dialysis regularly, a machine cleaning his blood because his kidneys no longer worked. Liver problems, heart problems. His body was failing. The consequences of a lifetime of drug use. George did some interviews in his final years. He appeared at screenings of Blow. He told his story to journalists, podcasters, anyone who'd listen. His message: don't do what I did. Crime doesn't pay. I lost everything. Was he sincere? Or just trying to make money from his fame? Probably both. George had an Instagram account. His daughter Christina ran it. He posted photos, reflections, thoughts. He had hundreds of thousands of followers. People were still fascinated by his story. In interviews, George was consistent. Crime doesn't pay. I lost everything that mattered. I made $100 million and died broke. It was all for nothing. Don't make my mistakes. Money isn't worth your family. The movie shows 2 hours of my life. I lived with the consequences for 78 years. He seemed genuine. He'd lost too much to not have regrets. His daughter, 20 years in prison. His health, his money, all of it, gone. But some skeptics said he just wanted sympathy, wanted to remake his image. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. He regretted the consequences. Whether he regretted all his choices is less clear. Regret isn't the same as redemption. Regret is feeling bad about what happened. Redemption is making amends, changing who you are. George couldn't undo the harm he'd caused. The cocaine addicts, the families destroyed. He could only sit with his regrets. George's old partner, Carlos Lehder, was still in prison. Carlos had been serving a life sentence in the United States since his extradition in 1987. In 2020, Carlos was finally released after 33 years, deported to Germany. Now free in Germany, George and Carlos never reconciled. They never spoke after their arrests. Their partnership had destroyed both their lives. Pablo Escobar was killed by Colombian police on December 2, 1993. shot dead on a rooftop in Medellín. George watched the news from prison. The man he'd worked with, the most powerful drug trafficker in history, dead at age 44. The Medellín Cartel, destroyed. The cocaine empire, gone. Everyone from that era, dead, in prison, or in hiding. George's health declined rapidly in his final years. Multiple hospitalizations, kidney failure worsening, heart problems. His family prepared for the end. His last Instagram posts were sad. Photos from the hospital, reflections on his life, gratitude for Christina's forgiveness, regret for his wasted life. George Jung died at home on May 5, 2021. He was surrounded by his daughter Christina and her family. Cause of death, kidney and liver failure, likely from decades of cocaine use. Age, 78 years old. He'd been free for only 7 years after 20 years in prison. Major news outlets covered his death. The man who supplied America's cocaine dies at 78. Real-life blow smuggler George Jung dead. Drug smuggler made famous by Johnny Depp dies. He was remembered as a cautionary tale. Material possessions. Nothing, no money, no property. Legacy. A movie about his life, a daughter who forgave him grandchildren, who knew him briefly, a warning to others, and the lives he destroyed. Cocaine addicts, thousands, maybe millions, indirectly families destroyed by addiction deaths from overdoses, other criminals who followed his path, his own family's decades of suffering. The movie Blow has 2 versions of the ending, depending on which cut you watch. In one version, George imagines the reunion with Christina, but it doesn't happen. In reality, he did get that reunion. Christina did forgive him, but only after 20 years in prison, only after missing her entire childhood and young adulthood. The movie captures the tragedy. The reality was even sadder, because George got his daughter's forgiveness, the thing he wanted most, but he'd still wasted most of his life. He'd still missed what mattered. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. It's grace. It's a gift. It's beautiful. But it doesn't give you back the time you lost. What did George Jung accomplish in his 78 years of life? He made over $100 million. He lived luxuriously for about 5 years. He became famous through a movie. That's it. What did George Jung lose? 20+ years in prison, his health, his marriage, 20 years of his daughter's life, his parents' final years, all his money, his freedom, his dignity, his life. Essentially, he died at 78, but his real life ended at 42. 5 years of wealth and excitement. 73 years of consequences. Was it worth it? Not even close. George Jung wasn't the cocaine epidemic, but he was a major contributor to it. Let me give you context on what was happening in America in the late 1970s and 1980s. In 1976, an estimated 1.6 million Americans used cocaine. By 1982, that number had exploded to over 10 million users. George claims he supplied 85% of America's cocaine during his peak years. That's almost certainly an exaggeration, but even if he supplied 20 to 30%, that's still millions of users. Every one of those users was a person. Cocaine is extremely addictive. Users become dependent quickly. It destroys lives, careers, families. People lose their jobs because of cocaine addiction. They lose their marriages, their children. Some die. Heart attacks from cocaine use, overdoses, accidents while high. How many people died because of the cocaine George Jung supplied? Impossible to count, but the number is substantial. In the mid-1980s, a new form of cocaine emerged: crack cocaine. Crack is cocaine that's been processed into a rock form that can be smoked. It's cheaper than powder cocaine, more accessible, and more addictive, much more addictive. Crack cocaine devastated inner-city communities in America. Murder rates skyrocketed, families torn apart, children born addicted to crack. Mass incarceration followed, harsh drug laws, mandatory minimum sentences. The war on drugs intensified. George's cocaine, the powder cocaine he smuggled, eventually became crack in many cases. He bears partial responsibility for that epidemic. Every cocaine addict has a family that suffers. Children of cocaine addicts, growing up with parents who are absent, erratic, sometimes violent, spouses of addicts, watching their partners destroy themselves, parents of addicts, watching their children throw their lives away. George enabled millions of addictions. The suffering is incalculable, and he did it for money. This is a question worth exploring. Arguments that he was evil. Cocaine was addictive and harmful. He chose profit over people's lives. He enabled an epidemic that destroyed communities. He showed no remorse until consequences hit him personally. He lived lavishly, while others suffered from his product arguments that he wasn't evil. He never killed anyone directly. He didn't force anyone to use cocaine. People chose to buy it. He was meeting demand, not creating it. He was an addict himself. His judgment was impaired. He was a product of greed and circumstance. Not inherent evil. George Jung wasn't a monster like some criminals. He wasn't a serial killer. He wasn't a terrorist. He wasn't a violent psychopath. But he was an ordinary person who made terrible choices. He was motivated by greed, by ego, by addiction, by the excitement of a lifestyle. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He knew it hurt people. He didn't care, because the money was too good. This is what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. Evil doesn't require monsters. It just requires normal people making selfish choices. George Jung is a perfect example. I've covered other criminals in this series. Let's compare. Frank Rosenthal, casino, ran casinos, skimmed money, committed fraud and theft, hurt people financially, but not with a physical product. Henry Hill, Goodfellas, robbery, theft, some violence, involved in murders, though didn't commit them himself, hurt people directly, but on a smaller scale. George Jung Blow supplied cocaine that addicted and killed millions indirectly. Massive societal harm, even though indirect. George's crime had the biggest societal impact of any subject I've covered. George's original dream was understandable. He watched his father struggle financially. He wanted to escape that. He wanted money, security, success. To prove he was somebody, that's the American dream. Work hard, succeed, prosper, but George perverted it. He wanted the success without the work. He wanted the money without the ethics. He wanted the American dream, but wasn't willing to earn it legitimately. And that perversion destroyed him. What should young people learn from George Jung's story? Lesson 1. Easy money doesn't exist. George made millions quickly, but he lost it all even faster. Easy come, easy go. Legitimate money is slower, but sustainable. You build wealth gradually. You keep it. Criminal money is fast but temporary. You burn through it. Then you lose everything. Lesson 2. Crime has consequences, not just prison. Loss of family, loss of health, loss of dignity, loss of freedom, loss of time. You can't enjoy money from a prison cell. And you can't get back the years you lose. Lesson 3. Addiction destroys. George's cocaine addiction made him stupid. He made terrible decisions. He got sloppy. He lost everything. Addiction is slavery. It controls you. It ruins you. Lesson 4. Family matters most. George would trade all the money for his relationship with his daughter. Money is temporary. Family is forever. If you don't destroy it, George destroyed his family for money. Worst trade of his life. Lesson 5. There's no glamour in prison movies make crime look exciting. Prison is boring, degrading, soul-crushing. 20 years in a cage is 20 years of life gone forever. Lesson 6. You can't escape consequences. George ran, he hid. He escaped from prison. Eventually, they caught him anyway. Consequences always catch up. Better to face them early than let them compound. Did the movie blow, help, or hurt? Arguments it helped. Shows consequences. Clearly George loses everything in sad and alone serves as a warning argument it hurt. Johnny Depp makes George look cool, the wealth and lifestyle look appealing. Some viewers focus on glamour. Not consequences may inspire copycat criminals the reality. Probably both. Some viewers learned the lesson. They saw the tragedy. Some viewers only saw the money and excitement. Human nature. We see what we want to see. Shortly before his death, George gave an interview. The interviewer asked, "Was it worth it?" George's answer, "No, I'd give it all back for my daughter's childhood." What would you tell your younger self? George, run, get out after the first arrest, get a legitimate job, be with your family. Any regrets? George, everything. I regret everything. Did he really mean IT? I think yes. He'd lost too much to not have regrets. But regret doesn't equal redemption. Regret is feeling bad. Redemption is making amends. George couldn't undo the harm he'd caused. He could only sit with his regrets and warn others. Christina Jung suffered greatly because of her father's choices. She grew up without him. Her childhood was chaos. An addicted mother, an absent father. She had trust issues, abandonment issues, but she forgave him. Why? Because he was her father. Because she loved him despite everything. Because she saw his genuine remorse. Because she chose compassion over bitterness. But forgiveness doesn't erase pain. It doesn't give back the years she lost. Forgiveness was her gift to him. He didn't earn it. She gave it. George had opinions about drug policy. He said cocaine should be legalized and regulated. His argument, prohibition creates criminals. If cocaine were legal, the government could control it, tax it, treat addiction as a health issue. This is a debatable position. The counter-argument, legalizing cocaine would increase use. More addiction, more deaths, the reality. George's opinion was self-serving. He profited from prohibition. Drug policy is complex. But George's views shouldn't carry weight. He's not exactly an objective expert. George Jung wasn't an evil genius. He was a regular guy who chose the wrong path. Greed plus opportunity plus lack of immediate consequences equals disaster. He represents thousands of drug dealers. Most aren't famous. Most die unknown in prison or on the streets. George got lucky with the movie, but unlucky with life. What if he'd chosen differently? After his first arrest, 1974, if he'd gone straight after his marijuana conviction, age 32, still young, could have found legitimate work. He was smart, personable, capable, could have been a salesman, manager. Anything, could have had a normal life if he'd ignored Carlos Lehder, could have moved back to Massachusetts, found legitimate work, been present for Christina's childhood, built a real life. So many chances to change course. Every time he chose the money. Every time he chose wrong. George Jung's life proves crime doesn't pay in the end. Family matters more than money. Addiction destroys everything. Easy money is a trap. Prison is hell. Regret is real. Redemption is hard. Consequences are inevitable. Time lost can't be recovered. Love requires presence, not money. You've now seen the complete true story of George Jung. Born August 6, 1942, a regular American kid from Weymouth, Massachusetts. He wanted to escape poverty. He watched his father struggle working honest jobs. He decided he'd find a different way. He made a terrible choice. Selling marijuana in California in the 1960s. He made a worse choice. Smuggling marijuana across the country. He made the worst choice. Going to prison and learning to smuggle cocaine instead of going straight. At his peak, from 1978 to 1982, George Jung was one of the largest cocaine traffickers in American history. He supplied a significant portion of America's cocaine in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He made over $100 million. He partied with Pablo Escobar. He lived in mansions, drove exotic cars, had everything money could buy. He lost all of it. He spent 20 years in prison. He lost his wife. He lost 20 years of his daughter's life, her entire childhood and young adulthood. He lost his health, his money, everything that actually mattered. The movie Blow, starring Johnny Depp, shows this story in 2 hours. But George Jung lived with the consequences for 78 years. He got out of prison at age 72, reunited with his daughter Christina, who forgave him. He lived 7 years as a free man. He died on May 5, 2021, at age 78, broken health, broken life, but with one thing, his daughter's forgiveness. He'd tell you, it wasn't worth it, not even close. The money? Gone within years, the fun? Brief, a few years of excitement, the consequences? Eternal 50-plus years of regret, loss, and suffering. This is the true story behind Blow, not the movie version. The real version, the version that shows. Crime doesn't pay. Easy money destroys. Addiction kills. Family matters most. And time lost with people you love can never be recovered. If you watched this story, thank you. This was George Jung's complete life. From Earth to death, nothing left out. The full truth. Subscribe right now because I'm covering more real stories. Coming next, another major crime movie's true story building, a complete real stories behind movies series. If you liked my Godfather, Casino, or Goodfellas videos, you'll want them all like this video. Hours of research and storytelling deserves that thumbs up. It tells YouTube this is valuable content. Comment below. Did George Jung deserve forgiveness? Was the movie Blow accurate? What shocked you most about the real story? Should I cover Pablo Escobar's full story next? Share this with anyone who thinks drug dealing is glamorous. Show them what really happens. This wasn't a movie. This was real life, a wasted life, a cautionary tale. George Jung made hundreds of millions of dollars and died with nothing but regrets. He had one thing at the end, his daughter's forgiveness. That was worth more than all the money he ever made. Remember that. George Jung said in his final interview, "I thought I was smart. I thought I'd beat the system. I thought money was everything. I was wrong about all of it. The only thing that mattered was the one thing I destroyed, my family. May he rest in peace. May his story serve as a warning." This was the real George Jung, the man behind the movie Blow, the man who supplied America's cocaine, the man who had everything and lost it all. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.